I would like, first of all, to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. We're very proud of the Indigenous traditions of this area, and of course this site has a particular historical significance, and there were, in the very early years of the orphan school, there were Aboriginal children along with what I guess were then British children at the orphan school, and it was a very important social institution in the early days of the colony, which wasn't a very friendly place overall, but this was meant to be a place of refuge and care for young children. So we are proud to enjoy both legacies, and I wanted to make that acknowledgement before I begin. The speech of the night is Kay's, but I just wanted to say a few words about Fay. There are several reasons for me to feel a connection with Fay, and an admiration for her vision, her pioneering spirit, her commitment to understanding and her intellectual integrity. I too was born and grew up in South Australia, and when I went to Adelaide University, Fay was truly an exception. She was probably the only woman professor there at the time, in a grey-suited sea of other professors who sort of wafted past we young undergraduates. And at that particular time, really the cultural identity and the intellectual relationships were with the old country. I mean, people related to the UK, whereas Fay's own intellectual development was firmly grounded in her country of birth and in the realities of this particular emerging nation as it was still at the time. Fay's first and enduring intellectual interests were the experience of Indigenous people in South Australia, their colonial past and impoverished present, their experiences of racism and the law, their lives in urban South Australia, and the role and status particularly of women. She gave voice to the people of the state who were normally quite invisible, who had no voice. And she was among a very small number of non-Aboriginal people in the 50s and 60s for whom Indigenous people were not profoundly other. They were not invisible. They were not, most certainly, a dying race. In all of her work in public life, Fay was a clear and consistent advocate of the translation of knowledge to address the major problems of society, the application of both her own research and that of others to the impact of prejudice and the power and policies of the state on the Aboriginal experience of the law were prominent in her work. In her time as VC at UWA and subsequently as president of the AVCC, she was more prominent, I think, in the public mind and nationally for her reasoned, passionate and critical commentaries on higher education, and as a very effective advocate for the independence, integrity, value and future of all of our universities. The significance of Fay's time in universities is not solely in her fine scholarship and advocacy, nor her organisational achievements at Adelaide Uni or UWA, but her leadership and inspiration more broadly as one of the two first Vice-Chancellors in Australia who were women. So she was a pioneer in the higher education scene as well. She was never reluctant to speak plainly about the place of women in Australia's universities, and she and Di Yerbury at Macquarie really did endure the slings of outrageous calumnies, if you like to put it that way. They basically had a very bad time in their early years in both of those universities, and she understood very well the structural, professional and personal barriers to advancement of women in the gendered power relations and roles, particularly in universities at that time, which acted as a barrier to women's careers and advancement. The pioneer and early feminist, Catherine Helen Spence, who migrated to South Australia in 1839 and whose name was given to the scholarship which took Fay to Oxford, was quoted, it's written about as saying on her 80th birthday, this is Catherine Helen Spence, "I am a new woman and I know it. I mean an awakened woman, awakened to a sense of capacity and responsibility, not merely to family and household, but to the state, to be wise not for her own selfish interests, but that the world may be glad that she has been born." And Fay was certainly for us at that time, and I think for many here, a new woman of her era, one who keenly understood and enacted her responsibilities to the state, to our universities, to her family, but who was unselfish in her accessibility for her students and her support for others. And we certainly are glad she was born. So thank you all and welcome.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor. My name's David Goodman. I'm the New South Wales convener of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, and that's why I'm here. As you know, the Fay Gale lecture has been set up in Fay Gale's memory, and it will be travelling around Australia in the near future, here first and then going to, I think, Wollongong and then to Adelaide, and that's where it will take place. The Academy, as you know, and some of you I know are members looking around the audience, exists to promote the social sciences in Australia, and we try to do that in a number of different ways. Perhaps not as actively as we would like sometimes, but in these straitened times we do what we can. It's nice to have, in a sense, the oldies mentoring the young ones, and perhaps that's the best way of looking at the whole operation. I think the lecturer tonight is going to be introduced by Catherine Gibson, and so I'll ask her to take over from me before I get any more embarrassed. I should say, though, I almost met Fay Gale once. I was at Murdoch University, along with a couple of other people in this room, at the point at which UWA and Murdoch were going to be merged. And whilst this was going on, whilst the merger was being discussed and taking place, UWA went ahead and appointed Fay Gale as Vice-Chancellor. And those of us who were, I suppose in those days we would have been known as dangerous lefties, all went, "Oh, wonderful, a woman Vice-Chancellor!" And you know, the buggers got us. Before we could even serve under her, the Liberals, or the Nationals, I beg your pardon, in State Parliament had decided that for the sake of teaching, the two universities should not be merged. The exact speeches that were made in the Parliament went down, have been etched in my memory. Of course, it made no difference to the numbers, but the speeches were like this. Under no circumstances should we allow this merger to go forward. I believe there's too much research going on in universities. Let us concentrate on teaching. And with that, I'll hand over to Catherine.
Well, thank you. I'm Catherine Gibson from the Centre for Citizenship and Public Policy here at University of Western Sydney. And I'm very delighted to have been asked to introduce Professor Kay Anderson to you. Okay. There's, I think, no more fitting person to be delivering the inaugural Fay Gale lecture, as Kay was inspired by Fay's undergraduate teaching, her honours supervision, and her honours supervision when she was a student at the University of Adelaide in the early 1980s. It was under Fay Gale's mentorship that Kay became a geographer. And though she left Adelaide to study for a PhD at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Kay and Fay maintained a close and enduring professional relationship over the many years since that time as an undergraduate student, one that bore much fruit, including a co-edited book in 1992 called Inventing Places, Studies in Cultural Geography. I know that Kay, along with the rest of the Australian geographic community, are thrilled that the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia has instituted this important lecture in honour of one of our most dedicated and dear colleagues. A colleague who, I must mention, I think, in this week in which we've celebrated International Women's Day, and as Jan alluded to, I think, blazed a way for women in academia and for feminists within the kind of maps and chaps dominated discipline of geography in Australia. So Kay is an internationally recognised scholar in cultural geography and race historiography. Her work has played an important role in shaping the subdiscipline of Anglophone cultural geography and has had a significant influence over human geography as a discipline, especially during the 1990s, when the cultural turn brought contemporary social theory more clearly into conversation with geographic inquiry. Her scholarly research on dominant discourses of race and their impacts on processes of governing racialised urban bodies gave rise to a monograph in 1991 entitled Vancouver's Chinatown, Racial Discourse in Canada, 1875 to 1980. This book was awarded the John Porter Prize of the Canadian Sociology and Anthropology Association in '93, and was chosen as an outstanding book by the Gustav Myers Centre for the Study of Human Rights in the United States in 1992. Vancouver's Chinatown has been used in many university-level courses, both within Australia and cognate areas in geography and cognate areas around the world, and now it's in its 5th edition. Kay Anderson's research combines fine-grained empirical analysis and searching theoretical agendas, and represents, I think, some of the best geographical scholarships currently available. Her ongoing interest in nature-culture retheorisation, in race and racism, identity and nation building, recently culminated in a new monograph, Race and the Crisis of Humanism, which was published in 2006. In this book, Anderson explores the impact of colonial encounters in Australia on the international knowledge about human difference in the 19th century, and advances, I think, the exciting thesis that cross-racial encounters in Australia precipitated a crisis in existing ideas of what it meant to be human. This important book was awarded the New South Wales Premier's Literary Award for Critical Writing in 2008. Kay has held positions in the Department of Oceanography and Geography and Oceanography at University College, University of New South Wales, the ADFA College, which of course was a real centre of maps and chaps. The Department of Geography, University of Durham in UK, which I think was a much more conducive environment, and currently is a professor at the Centre for Cultural Research here at the University of Western Sydney. She's held appointments as a Leverhulme Trust Visiting Fellow at Oxford University and a Smuts Visiting Fellow at Cambridge. In 2004, she was elected to the Academy of Learned Societies for the Social Sciences in the United Kingdom, and in 2007 elected a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. And in 2009 she was appointed a Fellow of the Institute of Australian Geographers. Geographers are notorious, I think, for our chameleon-like ability to pass as others in the differentiated disciplinary landscape. Perhaps this is one of our particular skills. Certainly the work of geographers is increasingly being cited and engaged with outside our discipline, and I think Kay Anderson's work is exemplary in this regard. Her research has been recognised for its contribution to critical race theory, to Indigenous studies, post-colonial studies, Asian American studies, history, sociology and anthropology. Though now she's working in a cross-disciplinary context, as I note are a number of us geographers across the University of Western Sydney, she maintains her connection to human geography and continues to provide excellent academic leadership in this field. Kay has been inspired by Fay Gale, I think, not to shy away from the difficult challenges of thinking about people in place, to critically engage traditions of thought, to bring field experience to bear on scholarship, and to work towards building a more humane world. The title of her lecture tonight is A Provocation from the Periphery, Rethinking the Human in Memory of Fay Gale. Thanks, Kay.
One toils away earnestly, some days ineffectually in front of the empty computer screen, other days immersed in a creative rush, and 3 or so decades later it's possible to talk about a life's work. For me, the curiosity to get to grips with the rise and resilience of that discourse of human differentiation called race became, during the course of a journey across disciplines, something of an intellectual passion. This intrigue has to do not just with the unfortunate material impacts of the race concept, meted out, as we know, so rampantly in diverse forms of racism to those reckoned to be on the wrong side of it, but also because for the longest time I've found the concept itself most peculiar. How? Why is it, in the face, as it were, of such vastly differentiated gradients of phenotypical, physical and cultural variation has existed the world over for such a long time, how is it that such a deterministic conception of difference came about? What made possible the intelligibility of the idea that the rich diversity of the world's people could actually be fitted into racial categories? And why the endurance? Despite, yes, the Obama factor that inclines some people today to talk about post-racial times, I say to that, tell that to a detained Aboriginal at St Mary's Juvenile Justice Centre. Why race's persistence? Why its resilience when the idea of a divided human family was supposed to have been laid to rest by Darwin some 150 years ago. And if not then, by that claim for a shared human inheritance, then the claims of population geneticists some 60 years ago. The usual answers given of some impulse of people, whether it be an impulse that's assertive or anxious, the usual answer given of some impulse of people to ethnocentrism or prejudice is usually the one we hear about, or in more recent critical accounts, some ideological will of power and identity of certain people over others. Lines of argument that have of course been very differently elaborated by generations of social scientists. These answers have, to my mind, been variously adequate to my mind, but not sufficient, as I'll come to later. That's when I'll turn in the lecture today to relay a bit about my efforts to dig into and chip away at some rather fundamental Western premises through which it's my intuition. A concept of innate human difference got to have its very footing at a particular historical juncture. And while decades now of post-colonial critique of Western ideas of progress, civilisation, modernity, developmentalism have certainly helped unsettle the ground in which that concept of fundamental human difference became buried, ever latently so, there's more work to be done, I maintain, new conversations to convene, at least if I can convince the ARC, to push on race's theorisation. There's hard ontological work at stake, and yet my hunch, or at least hope, is that the effort is worthwhile more generally, at a time when scholars in many fields, and not just race historiography, are trying to overcome blockages in the way of the deeply integrative thinking that the Centre for Cultural Research at this university agrees is needed to confront the complex challenges of the 21st century. And right at the end, I'll have a bit to say about the 21st century, and also a few bits in between. The move that interests me most in this respect right now, and as a geographer by training, as we've heard, is one that engages a starkly defining knowledge demarcation. Most classically, this is a divide between the domains of, on the one hand, human affairs, that is, human sociological affairs in which the subject of race has long been positioned, and on the other hand, environmental affairs, in which the human characters are typically figured as entering a stage they impact from outside as variously masters, managers, observers, guardians, or saviours. Most generally then, my talk this evening dwells at the interface of the knowledge, and of course there are also policy domains of society and nature, where my narrative interest is going to be in communicating an account not only for what it might have to offer a potential re-theorisation of race, it also aims to provoke a more open disposition to the very possibility of reparation across those split domains of society versus nature. But more of that, like I said, later. Chipping away, scratching at the door of seemingly settled truths, writing from the margins, I conjure up Fay Gale here, who for me was the person who fanned those sparks of restless curiosity and conviction at a formative educational stage. Fay was born a geographer. As a young, untold dyslexic girl, she enjoyed reading maps more so than words, and was always interested in the evidence of the world around her, the immediate qualities of places and landscapes, the raw material of knowing and of being there. She was a formidable walker, as I was to find out when she decided to skive off one day. I hope you're allowed to do this, Professor Reid. When she skived off one day for 2 days as VC at UWA to drive us to a former Aboriginal mission that used to be run by Benedine monks. A trip that also took us far inland from Perth to the well-known wildflowers. With me then, an Associate Professor of Geography, managing to read a road map completely incorrectly and getting us totally lost. In part, I should say, in my defence, because Fay kept talking so incessantly and so ardently about the singularity of the physical and cultural layers of the landscape that were before our eyes. The week-long field trips that she ran as a teacher at Adelaide University were transformative experiences for her undergraduate and honours students. I was one of those students, and I speak today in honour of this person who left footprints on my life and, as I expect to convey this evening, on my work. I'd like to thank the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia and its representative here, Professor Goodman, Director of the Institute of Social Sciences at the Sydney University, for the initiative of this lecture series. I'd like to thank Vice-Chancellor of the University of Western Sydney, Professor Reid, who clearly from her talk had her very own experiences of enchantment, if I can say, in the company of Fay, and does herself, I believe, stand in further testimony to that impact of Fay. I'd like to thank too my colleague and friend, my College of Arts colleague and friend here at UWS, Cathy Gibson, Professor Cathy Gibson, for her characteristically fluent and thoughtful and very warm words of introduction. And I'd like to thank you all for coming here this evening, some of you further afield than others. They say that what matters most about our tombstones is not so much the two dates marking our beginning and our end, but instead rather the tiny dash, as it were, if you can see up there, that tiny dash that lies in between them. Well, in the case of Fay Gale, there's much that is condensed into that tiny or mere line. So many contributions across different fields and sectors, as we've already heard. Fay's intellectual influence is my concern here tonight, and it's fitting, I think, that there'd be a series in her memory, because although none of us really, I think, can ever know or measure the reach and the impact of our work, told as we increasingly are to prove it, Fay was fortunate to live long enough to see a demonstrable influence on the trajectories of many of the undergraduate and graduate students that she supervised at Adelaide University. So let me spend just a few minutes trying to convey something of the moral compass that Fay set at what is, after all, an inaugural lecture in her honour. It was palpably obvious to a cohort of we students from the whiter than whiter suburbs of Adelaide in the 1970s that Fay, the teacher that is, was promoting a new sort of geography at Adelaide University, one that stood at an angle to the prevailing scientific and quantitative modes of inquiry of the time. Her courses were a self-styled synthesis of strands of human and physical geography, a geography that sat at the interface of culture and environment, a geography that in the Australian context had, yes, and she was very passionate about this, had definitely to acknowledge the distinctive environmental and physical features of the continent, but also had to acknowledge the landscape imprints of the cultural orientations, or if we like to say the ways of seeing the world of the diverse people who populated it. This was neither fashionable nor respectable geography at the time. There was resistance from the geomorphologists and climatologists in the physical geography camp, and there was resistance from the quantitatively driven spatial scientists in the human geography camp. Of this opposition and her determination in the face of it, as the only female professor, as we've heard, for a number of years at Adelaide, I was to find out more much later on. But as a geographer in formation, and I should say at this point there were other students that I should mention here, Jane Jacobs, Richard Baker, Joy Wondersits, to name just a few of them. For me, I was always captivated by her creative thinking with interfaces. Her work dwelt at the intersection of, as I've said, the physical and human worlds, at the intersection of the real and the humanly perceived worlds. In an essay for the Australian Society for Human Biology that she wrote 20 years ago, she urged for more dialogue between, as she called it, culture and science. in her example, between Indigenous knowledge about caves on the Nullarbor Plain and the knowledge of karst geomorphology at the time, which was one of those sciences that was increasingly forced to adapt to the evidence, the shifting evidence about the timescale of the human occupation of this continent. There were other awkward intersections too on which her geographic imagination lit, and not least of these was the often opposed realms of city and Aborigine. Fay's book in 1972, titled Urban Aborigines, that grew out of her honours and PhD research on so-called part Aborigines, was an original exposition of people she met while travelling by truck around remote South Australia in the 1950s and 60s. People who migrated then to towns after generations of restricted lives on reserves. These were people who didn't fit the mould of supposedly real Aborigines, by which was popularly meant at the time traditional people, the desert people, who'd caught so much attention, especially from anthropologists after Durkheim's writings in the 1910s. There were encouraging anthropologists, however, especially William Stanner at ANU, who was struck by Fay's immediate interest that she had in people like her own foster sister, who lived with Fay and her Methodist missionary parents in suburban Adelaide. People then who were not of a time back there and not of a place out there in the back of beyond, but rather people who were neither black nor white, so-called, and instead living on the fringes of both groups, and who Fay could see were who were excluded precisely because of the fact that they were doubly invisible. Ever the one then to teach from the heart, using as much the tools of evocation and empathy to connect her students' lives to others, to other people's lives, but not just other people's lives in that kind of personal sense. She was also one to use evocation and empathy to connect we students to other times and also other policy moods, as much as she used the resources, the respected, perhaps more respected pedagogic tools of erudition and expertise. Fay instructed we students in culture's geographies, not only with lectures on, for example, Carl Sayers' theories of culture's evolution he was disseminating from the Berkeley School of Cultural Geography. She also invoked accounts of people and place, however mundane, and often using the art of juxtaposition, such as one account I recall about a boy from Arnhem Land who stayed at her family's house when she was a teenager, and how struck she was by watching his difficulty, barefoot, refusing shoes, negotiating the concrete pavements of her city neighbourhood. The pragmatist that she was, Fay would never do theory for its own sake, and in any event was never content to see Australia through the eyes of the global north. She preferred, in her defiantly particularistic way, to think with the landscape, as she said, that grew her up. So again, by way of a final example here, she would teach us about spatial segregation between groups of people, using, of course, the conventional tools, the abstraction of the map and all the overlays of census variables of class and ethnicity and so on. She would certainly use those and not shy from them. But she would also, shifting register, to use accounts of the disjunctions in the likes of her own foster sister's life, although she would never, of course, refer personally to Edna Walker. But Edna had been caught up as a stolen child herself in Australia's earliest genetic engineering project. So then, for we students, it was a case of segregation being dramatised, although never in a crusading kind of way, with a kind of account of the spatialised sequence of Edna's life journeys, from the Northern Territory campsite where she lived until age 9, to a compound in Darwin, thence to a missionary dormitory on Croker Island until the 1950s, then Edna's dispersal, south come the policy shift to assimilation in the 1960s, and her circulation through the missionary networks to which Fay's parents belonged, and from there to life in white suburban Adelaide, and eventual reunion with if not ever her parents, at least a brother that she hadn't seen in 50 years. Fay's themes then cut right across a range of social science disciplines: geography, anthropology, history, politics, among them. Her intersectional thinking and her vividly situated imagination was what I, for one student, carried away with me. Of course, there were also discomforts and disconnects as I set off, not as for a kind of conveyor belt straight out of Fay's classes, but on my own path. There was an ease that I felt in particular with the kind of minority studies cultural geography about Group X in Place Y that I'd grown up with at Adelaide. It was a very vaguely felt disposition against the seemingly voyeuristic premise of otherness in studies like my very own honours thesis, where I interviewed Vietnamese refugees in Adelaide. And it set me wondering, what on earth would I say if someone came to my door asking, "How long have you lived here? What have been your experiences so far of living in Adelaide? Have you found work? How long do you intend to stay here?" And so on. This vague kind of discomfort that I felt turned into sustained argumentation some years later, when with a Commonwealth Scholarship Fay suggested, she insisted that I apply for. And under the influence of a philosophical turn to post-structuralism that was embraced in the Department of Geography at the University of British Columbia in Canada in the 1980s, I produced a conceptualisation of Vancouver's Chinatown as an enclave that reflects more about the West than the East. The West cultures of race and racism, its changing Orientalist stereotypes, the way that circulated and had a whole series of material impacts right through all three levels of the Canadian state. This was a state that liked to pride itself on its multicultural progress in relation to the nation to the south. This work of critique, in the classic vein of identity politics, demonstrating that neither the racialisation of people's identity was fixed at birth, nor the racialisation of places like Chinatowns cast in stone, and that instead both were mutually constitutive dynamics within the power-differentiated cartographies of colonialism and global or international migration. This work of critique then took me a very long way indeed from the whiter-than-white suburbs of Adelaide, and from which it seems in hindsight I continue to journey. Some 10 years ago, I became convinced I could only get so far in answering the question I posed earlier regarding the sources and resilience of that classificatory grid of human differentiation called race, if I stayed within the frame of identity politics that I just tried to encapsulate. It would take too long to detail the limitations as I see them, identity politics framework for my immediate purposes. Suffice to say, and I would think rather too swiftly here, that the assimilation in critical race theory of the many ways of articulating racialised difference and inferiority, for example, to be clear, Chinese are wily and addicted to vice, Chinese are model citizens, Aborigines live closer to nature, African Americans have lower intelligence, and so on, all the subtly and not so subtly mutated forms of these beliefs. Tracking these only to the defence of white power, profit and privilege seemed to me to run up against a number of problems, and not least of functionalism, circularity and overgeneralisation. In short, racialised power, or trying to actually source racialised power in a will to power and identity, seemed to leave that will still rather inadequately to me unproblematised, as I want to come back to in a moment. Now, none of these problems for a minute wholly discredit the critical turn in race theory, which many of us continue to work with, to refine, and which I certainly continue to find useful in other aspects of my work, including an ongoing book project that I started too many years ago on Sydney's red fern. However, precisely because the idea of race has furnished some of the most pernicious justifications of exploitation known to us, I've wanted to understand its genealogy more rigorously. This, for me, has required a move beyond the terms in which race is usually considered. That is, as stated earlier, beyond the terms that confine it to an interhuman or intersubjective dynamic of identity politics. In all this, gnawing away, as I have been at the idea of race, while equipping myself with new theoretical tools taken from science and technology studies, for one, an emerging field of, that calls itself the post-humanities, I've been running with the intuition that understanding race entails a willingness to think across those distinctions of society and environment that I flagged up in the opening minutes of the talk. The 2007 book, Race and the Crisis of Humanism, began my ongoing effort to think race as a discourse on the human. I'll say just a tiny bit about this, mindful that some of you here will have heard all about it, and others of you here won't be familiar with it at all. And in any event, just in case this is sounding a bit like some of those awful kind of exercises in autoethnography, what this is actually about is trying to, of course, position what I'm going to come to very soon, which is the core of the lecture. Substantively, the work Race and the Crisis of Humanism tracks the colonial disturbance that was Australia, its people and place, to Christian Enlightenment notions of the human. It elicits the crisis induced in British colonial encounters by a place that bore no apparent trace of what was assumed to be the capacity of all people everywhere to separate from nature. A capacity that was thought to be constrained for some people in some places by environmental factors like climate and soil, but which nonetheless was presumed to be was presumed as a potential for all people everywhere, the world over, to cultivate crops, domesticate animals, and settle collectively into social communities. The book's narrative plot thus centres around the colonial confusion the Australian state of nature presented to those prevailing ideas of what it meant to be human. Namely, to be exceptional in the sense of being above or beyond nature, with nature conceived as two things. First, an external non-human world of environment out there, and second, an internal kind of animal-like corporeality, a composite animal baseness, if you like, that people have imagined themselves to transcend. Yet unlike other hunter-gatherer people encountered in Africa and the Americas, the Australian appeared to the colonists not to have taken distance from nature. And so just a few quick images then to capture this perplexity that was the Great South Land for British voyagers and early colonists, of hunter-gatherers who roamed and camped instead of using or making, more particularly, permanent settlements, of singular animals such as the kangaroo and others such as the platypus that couldn't be fitted at all easily into metropolitan taxonomies, that in fact defied those taxonomies. Perplexity too about this land that appeared to be empty and awaiting improvement. And so, as an aside here, misrecognising the yamming practices of Aboriginal women in pre-contact Australia in the northern part of the continent. And it's to this extent, the book argues, the Aboriginal Australian provoked upheaval in Christian Enlightenment ideas about the human. In this way, the book tries to make strange and shocking all over again the intellectual and affective turn to race determinism that took place in the effort to make sense of the apparent Australian anomaly. A turn to innatism it was that speculated if Aboriginal people don't move out of nature, and despite the very best efforts to entice them to do so, then perhaps they inherently can't and won't ever. Theorising the rise of race in this way from Australia, the book goes on to track the race idea over the 19th century. Let me move then to the core of the lecture now, under the title of Thinking with the Head. Lying at the back of that Southern story, which is Race and the Crisis of Humanism, and I mean Southern in the sense of Raewyn Connell's intervention, who sends apologies, that Fay Gale would have enjoyed, a book I think very much would have enjoyed, in its caution against Western knowledge's pretensions, its universalising pretensions. Lying in the background of my study was and continues to be for me a curiosity, one that keeps getting re-stimulated in the Australian context of this clash of civilisation that I just described. It's been a curiosity I've had for I can't say how long, about the logic and sources of European-derived ideas of human separateness from nature, and in particular from those sentient beings we gather together under that umbrella category called animals. It's been a curiosity that led me to reading post-humanist philosophies that acknowledge the problem of distinguishing human and animal as indeed a problem, recognising that while yes, humans as a species are unique, this is no unique kind of uniqueness, in that the differences between our species and non-human species is comparable in genetic terms to those that separate non-human species from each other. So to be clear on the post-humanist claim here, the query is not with the difference of people as a species per se, that's surely self-evident and non-controversial. Rather, it's to query the sense in which human difference is typically conceived as belonging to a different order, as then a qualitatively distinct kind of difference. So post-humanists, and they're now of course a very disparate set of scholars, like to trouble the all too familiar premise that people are somehow above nature and not just a different part of it. Added to that has been a faintly formulated intuition that our persistently popular Western ideas of autonomy from nature may have something to do with what increasingly appeared to me in my close work on race historiography as a particular idea of mind. Now, characteristically in Western philosophy and theology, the idea of mind is traced to the twin premises of reason dating right back to the ancients, and eternal soul from religious texts, notably from Genesis. And regardless of whether this attribute of mind is taken to be a force for good or evil, the entity of mind itself is usually, often, generally, taken to be uncontroversial. It's inscribed as a kind of black box that tends either to be just reified or vilified, including by feminist and ecological critiques, and of course that's to gloss a huge body of literature just there, but including by some feminists and some ecological critiques, which in turning more to the emotional or bodily or material aspects of culture, have tended just to avoid mind, leaving it intact as largely unproblematised. So mind has come to appear as a metaphysics even, that for better or worse, depending on one's point of view, was handed down from the ancients, elaborated in biblical anthropology, prevailed through Christian enlightenment, informed industrial modernity, justified a mastery of nature and in some arguments also of women, surpassed Darwin's claim for continuity with the apes, landed us on the moon, and evinces its both impressive and destructive evidence right into the present. But if we continue to maintain the unexamined premise that we enact our very humanity as we overcome nature, there's a risk, I think, of playing into the hands of the most recent advocates today of the thesis of human exception from nature. For just one of these advocates, Keenan Malik, in a 2001 piece, we people possess, and I quote, a unique and self-evident ability to transform ourselves, our natures, our worlds. This is now confirmed, he states, not by, and I'm quoting here, not by any lingering Christian metaphysics, but by the entire trajectory of civilization itself, from cave art to quantum physics and the conquest of space. For him, the existence of a uniquely human capacity to transcend nature lies in our very natures. Such breathtaking certainty about our human destiny no doubt informs the optimism of some today that there are no limits to the human inventiveness needed to overcome the threat of ecological catastrophe. There's nothing ultimately to worry about. With our technological prowess, and I am married to an engineer, we will sort it. I should have acknowledged him too. So in these kind of contemporary advocates of human exceptionalism, or the idea of human exception from nature, with our technological prowess, we'll sort it, she'll be right, etc. But with what I like to think of as the spirit of provocation that is Fay Gale, I believe a very loud rattle is needed in this fundamentally humanist cage. And it's with this purpose that my own concern has been to take a closer, harder look at how this idea of the human got to endure, and in particular at how confidence in some human mental capacity to transcend nature came to be sustained in today's supposedly secular world. For the next few minutes then, I'll be especially focused on the 19th century, when emerged in the science of craniometry a quite specific formulation of mind as intelligence, and later in the century come Darwinism of mind as mental evolution. It's a history that, as we'll shortly see, intersects with that of race, and not just incidentally, by the way, but constitutively. Now, ordinarily, the relative significance attributed by critical race theorists to craniometry is traced to the idea, fully articulated by phrenologists at the end of the 18th century, that the skull housed the brain as the organ of mind. For history of science critics Stephen Jay Gould and Nancy Stephan, the privilege accorded to the head by 19th century race scientists is not in itself contentious, or even, for that matter, really of interest. For Stephan, head measuring was an extension of the earlier Christian focus on skin colour. For Gould, the pernicious practice was symptomatic in his words, and I should add his very vague words, of, and I quote, the importance of mentality in our lives. For him too then, craniometry was simply a case of instrumental power turning race and race hierarchy into innate states that justified the crimes, as indeed they were, that went on in their name. In other words then, aligning himself still to a humanist paradigm of what I described earlier of identity politics, at least the way in which it's come to become a defining paradigm in the subdiscipline of cultural geography that I can track to as my own heritage. But to fold the head in this way into some inexhaustible trajectory of European othering is to gloss over the interesting specificity of the head in the whole fetishised calibration of human bodies that went on in this period. It's also to gloss over an interesting time period that repays more attention if the analytical optic on race is, as I'm trying to do here, reset to the wider horizon of the human. For this period of the late 18th and 19th century is precisely one in which the identification of the human, or at least the human's exceptional status, with a metaphysical defining characteristic was being challenged. It was being turned into a problem, a debate. Ancient and medieval accounts invoking the great chain of being from angels to insects were more generally under pressure from the rise of science, empiricism, biology, and especially anatomy. Scientists, after Linnaeus's 18th century classification of people as part of the order of nature, were contending that the human could and should be understood as a purely physical rather than metaphysical being. A new science of man, as it was called, led by comparative anatomists such as George Cuvier, was arguing that the human was one living being amongst others, and thus its features and the newly opened question of its uniqueness ought to be the matter of a purely empirical scientific inquiry. Determining the character of the human in physical terms, then, became a major scientific project, with efforts to assess and compare the anatomies of people and animals, and especially apes. But also, and arguably above all, to determine the material existence of a distinctly human form of mind, or, worded differently, to try to render reason in anatomical terms. This 19th century obsession with the head, in which the skulls of the world's people, including so-called mad, degenerate and criminal, and also some female skulls, mostly male skulls were used. This obsession in which the world's skulls were enrolled is, as mentioned earlier, ordinarily considered as just an instance, a thoroughly pernicious instance, as indeed it was, of scientific racism. To put things too succinctly, however, the possibility raised here is that craniometry has to also be understood in the context of this concern to establish a new science of the human. For in this context, the head acquired its significance insofar as it concentrated what were the very intense debates, the 19th century controversy about whether the human was more than another animal, and whether and how this more could be scientifically, which is to say anatomically, demonstrated. So a hypothesis then, trying to condense things as succinctly as possible here. Racial skulls were measured as part of an effort to determine the physical existence of mind. How, in methodological terms? By correlating the already known levels of development of various peoples, and so the already known extent to which they were presumed to have exercised some distinctly human capacity of mind, with variations in the size and shape of their skulls. Giving rise, for example, to comparative forms of presentation, such as this one from Samuel Morton in 1849, writing after the abolition of slavery in the United States. Noting too in this table, at the very base of it here, the Australians on this measure of what was just one of any number of indices used. This was called the cranial index. And it was an index that was derived by calculating the ratio of head width to length. So here, in this speculative argument that I'm proposing, the idea of race emerges out of a struggle to establish the physical distinction of humans from animals. And as such, racial discourse might itself be considered not only as an intersubjective dynamic of power or identity politics, which of course it is, but more fundamentally as a discourse on the human. As a discourse in which the very question of the distinctively human was at stake, and as a discourse in which the distinctiveness came to be formulated. This is to invert the usual social science analyses that reduce invocations of the more or less human and also of the more or less intelligent to some ethnocentric impulse or will. It's to trace this impulse itself to a certain problematic of the human, more specifically to the anxieties in the 19th century surrounding the cherished idea that the human is exceptional among beings. Anxieties that only intensified in the later 19th century period of evolutionary craniometry, when the science that tried to read off intelligence from head size and shape grew that much more fraught in the context of efforts to understand the human place in evolution, and especially Darwin's claim for continuity of people with apes. Some images then from this period of the 1890s, again note the Aboriginal Australian then called up then as part of what was, I think, evoked by these images of quite an interesting global specimen exchange economy. These images then from the evolutionary period. And it's then that we find, especially in the writings of Alfred Wallace, race again being constitutively invoked in evidence for connection to a whole new human-animal problematic, this time of evolution. Take Thomas Huxley, for example, in this image here from 1897, using again, if you like, the Australian, noting here as the kind of referential limit of what it was to be human here. So in this example then from Thomas Huxley, a claim then that it was the faculty of mind as located in the skull that was the agent of a distinctively human evolutionary development, now called culture, no less. And the madness of this frantic, but of course futile, search for some accurate correlation between physical features and some score of intelligence becomes clear in the sheer variety of measures, indices, ratios, and instruments that craniometrists proposed as the 19th century progressed, including the facial goniometer, the cephalometer, the craniometer, the cranioscope, the craniostat, the craniophore, and so on and so forth. These would be some of the things that I would like to look at in far more detail if this project that I've lodged as an ARC discovery for its very last time, I should remind my colleagues, in case they were worried, which of course they are. These are the kinds of details that I would like to look at more intensively. And I think, although I need to convince people, of course, that it's a very interesting and important project because few scientific projects were to be as devastating for Australia's Aboriginal people as evolutionary craniometry. To be clear, this was a project that drew on stereotypes of Indigenous people and other people too, in order to try and demonstrate the existence of a uniquely human capacity to surpass nature, a capacity which then came to constitute the very measure of what it was to be human. So while many other researchers, especially historians and anthropologists, have already railed convincingly and ardently and quite appropriately against the stereotype of Stone Age man, taking issue as they have in a culturally relativist way that makes a lot of sense with the ethnocentrism of a Western model of civilization. While there's been many people that have done this, and it's a very congested academic field, my own ethical and ontological concern here is different. Chipping away, as I wish to, at the peculiar ontology of the human that underpin the craniometric project. I've been trying to prise open the gate, as it were, that has been erected around the very presumption in this apparently secular moment after Darwin that to be human is to be the life form that becomes itself in transcending nature. So, I'm going to move now to the conclusion. And latterly, the new World Trade Center in New York City. And it was an editorial about the Barangaroo, I should say, proposal for the Western Rim of Sydney CBD. Its headline reads proudly, Barangaroo to become a visionary portal. And the editorial starts out like this. Cities are the grandest physical expressions of our humanity and are at the very heart of our culture. It goes on, quote, our design for Barangaroo brings the equivalent of a concrete backyard, a wasteland, back to life. Now, I'm not prone to brazen leaps over time, such as might be implied by this abrupt interjection to the present day. But I found myself pondering while digesting this piece, and at the same time as being able, yes, to actually admire, of course, some of the features of the new proposal. But I found myself pondering along these lines. From where stems the self-congratulatory tone, the bold confidence of the likes of Lord Rogers? And yes, I realise that he was actually making a sales pitch as the preferred developer for this site. But must the most convincing rhetorical move still be in this, the 21st century, a triumphal narrative that thinks we have displayed, and I quote, the very heart of our culture in surpassing what is otherwise merely, inertly, blandly there, as if without us to animate it, matter itself, and by its very nature, would be without meaning or purpose or coherence, lacking, lifeless, dead. I was moved to ask myself at the end of the editorial, how can there be change in the direction of a more sustainable form of human culture in the present day, beyond the now suspect modern investment in humanity's progressive control of nature, while we invest in such fantasies of nature transcendence? Fantasies of precisely the kind, and this was also from the Sydney Morning Herald from not long ago, a projection here. How is it that we're to imagine a more sustainable form of human culture in the present day beyond this now suspect modern investment in humans' progressive control of nature, while we continue to invest in fantasies of nature transcendence, fantasies of precisely the kind that I've been trying to trouble this evening? I was reminded too by the editorial of the complacency in the conviction of today's human exceptionalists, it's an awful word, that I mentioned earlier, for whom to recall, and I quote, our unique ability to transform ourselves, our natures, our worlds, is now confirmed by the entire trajectory of civilization itself, from cave art to quantum physics and the conquest of space. Perhaps it's this belief too that at some level prompts author Ian McEwan to state in a recent interview, human ingenuity will save us from climate change. There's also an uncanny regurgitation of the terra nullius myth by the good Lord Rogers of the rescue and redemption of an apparent wasteland that mutely awaits modern improvement. But if we probe, as I have here tonight, the very premise that mind is the assured marker of a human distinction from nature, if accordingly Australia's inhabitants are forced to acknowledge some shared being in common, as Cathy Gibson and Gerda Rolfink put it, with the non-human world, are there fresh prospects for reconciling settler and Indigenous values on this continent? I can hope so. What I do think is that in the Australian context, there's been a tendency to freeze the story of colonial racism in the narrative grip of inevitably antagonistic human identities, settler versus Indigenous. But by way of contrast, what I've tried to do here is pull race out of the sometimes polarising and stifling domain of identity politics in which matters of race are usually confined. And I've done this by drawing it instead into a broader ecological concern with the multiplicity of relationships in which human beings are embedded. The suggestion follows that the history of Australian colonialism has been as much bound up with the history of an incomplete secularisation of the human, to use a phrase from Bruno Latour in a recent article for the Royal Institute of Anthropology. The history of Australian colonialism has, I think, from having read that piece by Bruno Latour, has as much been bound up with the history of this incomplete secularisation of the human as it has been with inevitably opposed identities. It's a move that's potentially transformative, I like to think, politically and ethically, given that this history of incomplete secularisation is one that implicates us all. As such, perhaps it's the ground for more genuine intercultural dialogue, to adapt the phrase of my colleague Ian Eng, at a time when all Australians face the collective challenge of negotiating the terms of a new relationship to environment. Fay Gale, in an image here before she fell ill, Fay Gale would, I hope, have been intrigued, if not impressed, by this way of thinking the shared space of Australia, as she described the surface of this continent in a Cunningham lecture for the Academy in 1998. Her style of geography, taking in both landscape and people, certainly encouraged me to find ways of acknowledging that our entanglements and responsibilities can't be contained within the conventional conception of a culture that is opposed to nature. Her holistic geography inspired this quest, just as latterly it's taken a sense of purpose from the mission of the Centre for Cultural Research at this university to forge new modes of inter- or transdisciplinary engagement and inquiry. And so I'm going to conclude now on what I hope is an appropriately personal note. It's hard to measure the benefit that is gained from being exposed, as I was at an early age, to a woman who teaches, organises field trips, advises the government, manages staff and budgets, publishes, lectures, runs an international conference, supervises graduate students, applies for grants to do still more, and yet whose door remained open to all. It's only as one moves further along one's own academic path that it's possible to grasp just how much Fay was fielding and directing. Part of the key to her success was, I think, or is, to be found in the exquisitely tuned mix of certain professional, personal dispositions she held throughout her university roles. For me, they were a passion that did not preach, a compassion that did not crusade, and a matter-of-fact pragmatism, combined in the very best sense with the university mission of a deep respect for ideas and scholarship. From a city creek bed on one of Fay Gale's undergraduate excursions about sacred sites, to the lecture theatre at Adelaide University, where I met a role model who seemed to think so productively with more than just her brain, to the Aboriginal mission at Hermannsburg on an honours field trip, from which I returned with images of blighted lives that I won't ever forget, to the Canberra office of the Presidency of the Australian Vice-Chancellor's Committee, where we would sometimes meet for lunch while I tried to forget I worked at a military academy, to the ANU base of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia, where I had coffee with a president whose whole ethos seemed to encapsulate the very charter of that academy, to the Paris office of the Australian National Committee for UNESCO that she chaired, to the airport lounge where she and I worked on the book Inventing Places. Note, if you will, traces still lingering of military attire. She touched my life, as she did so many students who went on to pursue a range of professions. Fay leaves an inestimable legacy that I hope has been captured in at least some of the lines of flight I've charted this evening. I thank and pay tribute to her regardless. Thank you.